You've probably heard that alcohol is a modern indulgence, something invented alongside civilization, poured out at feasts once humans had already settled down, built cities, and figured out farming. That timeline is backwards. The evidence now points to something stranger. Our attraction to alcohol may predate agriculture, predate villages, predate the wheel, and even predate our own species. This is what the archaeological, genetic, and anthropological record actually shows. And once you see the full timeline, the modern image of alcohol as a late invention starts to look almost impossible to defend. Start before humans existed at all, because that's genuinely where the story begins. In 2014, biologist Matthew Kerrigan led a genetic study tracing a single mutation in the ADH4 gene, the enzyme responsible for breaking down ethanol in the body. Around 10 million years ago, a common ancestor of humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas developed a version of this gene roughly 40 times more efficient at metabolizing alcohol than the version carried by earlier primates. Not by accident and not for pleasure. Kerrigan's team argued this mutation appeared right around the time our ancestors shifted from living primarily in trees to spending more time foraging on the forest floor, where fermenting, fallen fruit was common and often unavoidable if you wanted to eat at all. This matters because fermentation isn't something humans invented. It's something that happens automatically the moment ripe fruit falls to the ground, splits open, and wild yeast gets to work on the sugar inside. Biologist Robert Dudley formalized this observation into what's now called the drunken monkey hypothesis. His argument runs like this. Animals that could detect and tolerate small amounts of alcohol in overripe fruit had a real survival advantage over animals that couldn't. Alcohol's smell signals ripeness and calories from a distance, long before an animal is close enough to see or touch the fruit itself. Tolerating that alcohol meant an animal could eat fruit that made its less tolerant competitors sick or sluggish. Our taste for alcohol, in other words, didn't start as recreation, celebration, or ritual. It started as a foraging tool, a way of finding calories other species were forced to walk past, millions of years before anyone had a word for fermentation, or for us. Now fast forward past millions of years of primate evolution to the species that could finally do something deliberate with that inherited biological tolerance. Modern humans, on purpose, not by accident, learning to make alcohol rather than simply stumble across it. The oldest confirmed evidence of intentional brewing comes from Raqefet Cave in modern-day Israel, examined by archaeologist Li Lu and her team in a study published in 2018. Inside the cave, researchers found stone mortars containing residue consistent with brewed, fermented wheat and barley, dated to roughly 13,000 years ago. The people who made it were Natufians, a hunter-gatherer culture that hadn't yet developed full agriculture as a way of life. They were brewing something resembling beer thousands of years before they were farming grain as a dependable staple food source. That single detail upends a much older assumption that shaped archaeology for decades. The dominant theory, first proposed by archaeologist Robert Braidwood back in the 1950s, held that humans domesticated grain purely to make bread, and that beer came later, almost as an afterthought, a byproduct of grain surplus. Raqefet Cave suggests the opposite may be closer to true for at least some early populations. Some researchers now argue for what's informally called the beer before bread hypothesis, the idea that the desire to reliably reproduce a fermented, mind-altering drink may have been part of what actually pushed hunter-gatherers toward the enormous, unglamorous labor of deliberately planting, tending, and harvesting grain in the first place, long before bread itself was the priority. Halfway around the world, with no possible contact between the two populations, the same pattern shows up completely independently. In Jiahu, China, archaeologist Patrick McGovern analyzed residue inside pottery jars dating back roughly 9,000 years. Chemical analysis revealed a fermented beverage made from a combination of rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit, one of the earliest confirmed alcoholic drinks anywhere in East Asia. McGovern, who has spent decades studying the chemistry of ancient organic residues, has pointed out that this wasn't a crude, accidental byproduct of spoiled food sitting in a jar too long. The recipe involved multiple ingredients combined in specific proportions, evidence of real experimentation, of people refining a process deliberately over time until they landed on a result they clearly wanted to repeat. Move forward again to Godin Tepe, a settlement in the Zagros Mountains of what is now Iran. Excavations there uncovered pottery vessels lined with a yellow residue later identified as calcium oxalate, commonly known among brewers as beer stone, a byproduct that forms naturally during the brewing process when barley-based liquid is left standing. Dated to around 3400 BCE, this find pushed confirmed large-scale beer production firmly into the era of early Mesopotamian civilization. By this point, brewing wasn't an occasional discovery made once and forgotten. It was infrastructure. Large storage vessels, specialized pottery shapes designed specifically for fermentation, and residue found in multiple containers across the site all point to something being produced regularly, in real volume, entirely on purpose. Here's where the picture gets more interesting, because alcohol in these early societies wasn't treated the way modern culture often treats it, as an optional indulgence set apart from real sustenance and reserved for special occasions. In ancient Sumer, beer was a dietary staple, consumed daily by most of the population, including children, largely because the fermentation process made water noticeably safer to drink and added usable calories that raw, unprocessed grain couldn't easily provide on its own. The Sumerians even worshipped a beer goddess, Ninkasi, and a surviving hymn dedicated to her, translated by Assyriologists in the 20th century, functions almost like a literal recipe. It describes the brewing process step by step in enough detail that modern brewers have actually used it to recreate the beverage in working batches thousands of years later. Egypt tells a strikingly similar story. Beer there wasn't a luxury item reserved for pharaohs or priests. Archaeological records, including wage documentation recovered from workers who built the pyramids at Giza, show that laborers were partially paid in beer, often several liters a day as part of their standard compensation. This wasn't about intoxication as recreation or reward for a job well done. It was payment, nutrition, and hydration rolled into a single substance, distributed on a scale that meant essentially everyone, from field laborers hauling stone to religious officials overseeing temple rites, drank it as a completely ordinary part of daily survival. So why did fermentation take hold everywhere, independently, across cultures that had no contact with each other and no way to share the idea? Partly biology. The ADH4 mutation inherited from that forest-dwelling ancestor meant humans could tolerate alcohol without becoming as ill as many other animals do when exposed to it. Partly practicality. Fermented liquids were consistently safer than untreated water, and they preserved calories from grain or fruit that would otherwise spoil and go to waste within days. And partly something harder to measure with a single instrument. Anthropologists studying ritual behavior across dozens of unrelated ancient cultures have repeatedly found alcohol embedded deeply in ceremony, in burial rites, in marriage rituals, and in ordinary communal gatherings. Something about altering ordinary consciousness together, in a group, mattered enough to human survival that it shows up in nearly every early civilization archaeologists have studied in real depth, across every continent where agriculture eventually took hold. That communal element may be the actual through line connecting a 10-million-year-old gene mutation to a Sumerian drinking hymn written thousands of years later. Fermented food likely started as a purely individual survival advantage, a way to find calories other animals simply couldn't detect or safely eat. But by the time humans were deliberately brewing on purpose, it had become something fundamentally social instead of solitary. Rockfet Cave shows clear signs of what researchers interpreted as feasting activity, happening alongside the brewing residue, not quiet, solitary consumption tucked away from the group. Groups gathering, sharing a substance together, deliberately, around a fire or a table. The same underlying pattern anthropologist Polly Wiesner documented around Johansi campfires with storytelling shows up here too, except with fermented drink instead of myth serving as the shared activity that bound people to one another night after night.
None of this means ancient alcohol use was harmless, or that it existed in some kind of purely functional, consequence-free bubble. Skeletal and historical evidence from later periods shows clear signs of overconsumption, social disruption, and outright dependency existing even in antiquity, long before anyone had a modern vocabulary for addiction. Babylonian and Egyptian texts both contain explicit warnings against excessive drinking, which only makes logical sense if excess was already a recognized, familiar problem within those societies.
This wasn't a golden age entirely free of consequence, and treating it that way would be its own kind of myth. The tension between alcohol functioning as nourishment, ritual, and genuine social glue on one hand, and alcohol functioning as a source of real harm on the other, is not a modern invention layered onto an innocent past. It's nearly as old as the brewing itself, running in parallel the entire time. What's actually changed over thousands of years isn't the underlying impulse toward fermented drink. It's the surrounding context that used to shape and contain it. Ancient brewing was communal by necessity, small batch by circumstance, consumed within tight groups of people who knew each other intimately and depended on each other daily, often woven directly into shared labor, shared ritual, and shared meals eaten together around a single fire. Modern alcohol production and consumption can happen in near total isolation instead, disconnected almost entirely from the community structures that once gave the act meaning beyond intoxication itself. The genetic tolerance running through your body right now is the exact same one carried down from that forest floor ancestor roughly 10 million years ago. The underlying chemistry hasn't changed at all. The social scaffolding that used to surround it has largely disappeared from modern life.
So, when archaeologists are asked when humans actually started drinking alcohol,
the honest answer isn't a single clean date you can circle on a timeline. It's a layered one, built up over an enormous stretch of time. 10 million years ago, a genetic mutation gave distant, tree-dwelling ancestors the biological ability to tolerate it in the first place. Long before agriculture existed as a concept, hunter-gatherers at Rakafet Cave were already fermenting grain deliberately, on purpose, for reasons that clearly went beyond simple accident. Independently, on the entirely other side of the world, with no shared contact whatsoever, the people of Jiahu were doing essentially the same thing with rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit. By the time actual cities existed, alcohol wasn't some luxury sitting quietly on the margins of civilization. It was foundational to it, nutritionally, socially, economically, and ritually, woven into nearly every layer of early human life that archaeologists have managed to reconstruct. You reach for a drink today, probably assuming it's a modern habit casually layered onto ancient, mostly sober lives stretching back into deep prehistory. The evidence suggests it's closer to the reverse of that assumption. Sobriety as a constant, unbroken, purely individual default looks, historically speaking, closer to the anomaly than the rule. For most of the time, humans have existed as a species, and arguably for millions of years before humans existed at all in our current form. Altering ordinary consciousness together in a group around shared food, around ritual, around each other's company, wasn't some rare exception to how people live their daily lives. It was one of the oldest, steadiest threads quietly running through the entire fabric of it, connecting a fallen, overripe piece of fruit on a prehistoric forest floor to a shared cup raised at a crowded table tonight.